The eLife podcast from eLife, the open access journal for outstanding research in the life and biomedical sciences. Online at elifesciences.org.
Hello, happy Christmas and welcome to episode 84 of the eLife podcast. I'm Chris Smith from The Naked Scientist, and this month, medicine by mobile phone across Africa sounds like a great idea, but how many people actually have a phone in the first place? Also, intercropping, where we grow multiple plants together, but are we using the wrong seeds when we do this? And signs that firstborns suffer 7 months of stress when a new brother or sister joins the family. But first, the era of digital paleontology means that guesswork and speculation about the size, speeds, habits and preferred habitats of dinosaurs and other ancient animals is rapidly being replaced by objective computer-based reconstructions. And if you're really ready to become the next Indiana Jones, you can even do all of that during your expedition.
My name is Paul Serino. I'm a paleontologist at the University of Chicago. I've just come back from an expedition to the Sahara, one of my favorite haunts. We found 35 tons of wondrous things from the past.
Did I hear that correctly? 35 tons?
That's correct, 35 tons. It's an enormous quantity of material because some of the dinosaurs are large. And so we went to 5 different time horizons in the country of Niger, in the heart of the Sahara is part of the country. And they have the best and the deepest record of dinosaurs. And among our finds, is the subject of today's podcast, Spinosaurus. We found new material of Spinosaurus, very exciting material of Spinosaurus.
Describe then, if I were wandering around, and I wouldn't be, but if I could go back in time and wander around at the time of Spinosaurus, A, how far back would I have to go? And B, how would I spot one?
Well, you hope you spot it before it spots you. But you'd go back about 90 million years. That time, which is what we call the late Cretaceous period. This part of Africa was a lot wetter than it is today. So we found petrified wood and giant fish. There were rivers and forests. There'd be a lush habitat. And there'd be this triumvirate of predators that you'd want to keep an eye out for because each one of them could do you in. The biggest of them is Spinosaurus. Not far behind is Carcharodontosaurus, blade-shaped teeth on that one. Spinosaurus, a fish-eating dinosaur. But there's a third one, rarer but dangerous and a little bit smaller, and that's an Abelisaur. And so these 3 predators, we find them for millions of years in Africa. We have nothing really like them living in the same period of time in North America. This is T-Rex territory in North America. Africa is a totally different dinosaur world.
So were they like T-Rex then, these Spinosaurs?
No, Spinosaurs were not like T-Rex other than they could do you in. They really had a fish-eating skull, but if they wanted to go after something else, they'd do it with their hands. Their forelimbs are among the strongest of any bipedal dinosaur. They are 4 feet long or 5 feet long with sickle-shaped claws. They had a snout that was really designed for going into mud, going into the shallow waters after a wide variety of large fish. That was clearly their mainstay, their specialty, but they were big enough to take anything down.
So they walked around on 2 legs, but were pretty good with these forelimbs, which they could use for fishing, but they could also use their face and snout for that.
Absolutely. And the eLife paper was, I think, settling the question of whether they were 4-legged on land or 2-legged. We actually spent a lot of time on that. We tried to work on where the center of mass was with a better reconstruction of the skeleton. And we find that it's not a fast-moving dinosaur on land, but it is, like all the other theropods on land, bipedal or 2-legged.
How did you work that out then? Because presumably what you've got to go on are skeletal remains, fossilized remains.
Exactly.
How did you then turn that into something that then tells us this was a 2-legged creature and this is how it moved, this is what it would have done?
Look, this is the age of digital paleontology. And for all the young folks out there that are listening to this, this is your time to get into paleontology. This is a digital age. And so even in the field, we were able to scan the fossils by stereo photographing and put them together while we were sitting in our expedition tent. Literally a few weeks ago, we were able to look at and move our Spinosaurus bones around. So what we did in the paper was, we start with the fossils and then we reconstructed Spinosaurus better than ever before by connecting the bones into the skeletons, making sure they were all pieced together correctly. Then we looked at modern animals, CT scans of modern animals to understand how much flesh we should put on this dinosaur. And we're surprised that we had made mistakes before, and papers had made mistakes. The tail needs a lot more muscle on it than had been previously put on it, because we looked at alligators, large lizards, they have a lot of muscle on the tail, it goes beyond the bone. And so when we did that, and then we checked out digitally, where was the center of mass? Would it balance over its hind limbs, or would it need its forelimbs to progress and land? The answer was definitive. It balanced over its hind limbs. Then we put it in water to see how well it could swim, what the forces were against the body with a big sail. This was an awkward animal to be swimming in water, and we proved that by putting it in water digitally, seeing where and when it would float, and then what it would do underwater, how fast it could swim.
When you say it's got an awkward sail, do you mean a sort of on its head, on its tail? Where was the sail tissue?
So people are very familiar with Spinosaurus and the sail. It's actually not one sail. It has three sails. There's one on the head, a small one in the midline. Then there's one on the neck that sort of pops out, we discovered after reconstructing it, and then it goes down again. Then the big one is on the back. And these are bony crests covered probably with colorful flesh, but they were stiff, bony crests. Now, you don't want something like that in water, and nothing that swims in water has anything like that. A sailfish, for example, which has a sail, it's retractable. And when it wants to swim, and it's one of the faster swimmers in water, it pulls that down. When it wants to brake, it pulls it up because it operates as a brake. There's nothing in water that looks like a Spinosaur for a good reason. The lizards that look closest to Spinosaurus with the big back sail, they don't use it in swimming, and they're not aquatic swimmers. And so we think we've fairly tracked down every conceivable line of evidence to test this idea of whether it was an underwater diving marine predator, or whether it was, in fact, a shoreline semi-aquatic animal that liked the shoreline, like crocodilians, and also was capable of walking on land on 2 feet.
So had people previously kind of cherry-picked the evidence a bit and made it fit together to make a nice story? This thing's got these sail structures. They look like they'd work in water. It's got a fish-eating head, therefore it was probably an aquatic dinosaur that occasionally went on the land. And that was the story they built. But you're saying if you do the digital paleontology and put it in water, it just doesn't float. It does float too much. It doesn't swim. It doesn't work.
You're right. The idea, I believe that we have formally sunk the idea with this paper, but we're open to challenges. That's what science is about. Look, science is about arguments. And when the first bones of Spinosaurus came to light, they were controversial. And the German scientists who described these a century ago from Egypt, they were all destroyed in the world wars that we've had. And we have refound their bones. When he described it as a fish-eating dinosaur, and he was very careful and conservative and accurate, but he didn't have enough of the skeleton. And when we found the skeleton, I made the argument that it was semi-aquatic. And then subsequently a tail was found, and the tail had a big sail on it as well. And so the back sail actually continues onto the tail. And we find now that the predecessors of Spinosaurus, one that I found in Niger earlier in time, Suchomimus, they also have this sail on the back, and it continues into the tail. And the idea came, well, maybe it was using it as a paddle. And this got to be very popularized in the last few years. It was an aquatic dinosaur diving and swimming with the tail. And so we put that to the test. And the test says, sorry, its sail was for advertising, like a billboard on land, and it could wade into water. It can go into 6 feet of water we show in the paper before it floats. But float this boat was going to happen because it's lighter than water. It has a lot of air inside its vertebrae, and it's very clumsy in water. So while it could have, most dinosaurs and even humans can swim, we are not aquatic animals, and it is not definitely an aquatic predator. When you're an aquatic predator underwater, you have to, especially if you're big, you have to be good, and you look like a whale, you look like an ichthyosaur, you do not look like a spinosaur. And so we put this to the test.
And if there is any space on the next expedition, Paul Sereno, can I come, please? The potential of the smartphone to place a doctor within reach of people in even very remote or poor settings means that we have an opportunity to improve healthcare delivery, even in places that have been regarded traditionally as hard to reach, both in economic and geographical terms. There are many communities like this across the African continent, for example. But how widespread is phone ownership across Africa? That's the critical starting point for any intervention, so operators can predict whom they can, and more importantly, whom they can't, reach this way. Sally Blower at UCLA has been looking at data collected from 33 African countries to try to form a picture of where the gaps might be.
In these resource-constrained countries, there's very poor healthcare infrastructure, and many people live far away from healthcare facilities, so they have to walk long distances. Having health interventions in which they can call in with phones means there'll be better healthcare, and people who live far away from it will have greater access to healthcare.
I must admit, I've travelled in southern Africa quite extensively. Most
Yes.
people I've bumped into in rural Africa tell me they would rather go without food than charge for their mobile phone.
Exactly. It has become an increasingly important part of life. People use it for business, agriculture, education, and government health services. For during COVID, many people, if you wanted vaccination, you had to go in using your mobile phone to access the services.
Well, that would suggest then that actually uptake is pretty comprehensive. Is that what you found?
We found it as pretty comprehensive in that about 80% of people in the 33 African countries we looked at own mobile phones. About half of these people own smartphones, so they have access to the internet, and the other half own basic phones. But there's a huge difference among the 33 countries we looked at. And obviously, if 80% own it, there's 20% who don't, and that's quite a large percentage of people.
Yes, indeed. Also, though, is that 80% of the population as a whole, but when you look at the stratification of that population, 100% of kids and a smattering of middle-aged people and no elderly people, or is it pretty generalised across? How does it break down?
There's a lot of inequity. When it comes to age, most of the phone owners are, because of the demography of Africa, most mobile phone owners are under 30, and they tend to own smartphones. People over 30 tend to own basic phones.
So that would argue then that we have actually got a problem in some respects, because most people in most countries, most of the time, access healthcare when they're older.
Exactly. So obviously for women and antenatal care, that will be younger women generally. But yes, for healthcare, that's correct. And then we found great inequities into who actually owns mobile phones.
In what respect?
Well, there are great gender differences. So men are twice as likely to own mobile phones than women. And we found urban-rural differences. People living in urban areas are about 3 times more likely to own mobile phones than people in rural districts. The age difference I've mentioned, and wealthy, that the poorer you are, the less likely you are to own a mobile phone, though we did find some interesting differences in that some people who are very poor do own smartphones.
I was going to say, is this just a function of wealth? Because a lot of those factors do really co-localise with people who are likely to be in work.
Yes, it does. It does depend a lot on wealth, but wealth can be men and women in a couple can have the same level of wealth, but still the man is likely to own the phone and the woman is not likely. So it's not a simple function.
This is quite fine-grained data from 33 countries. How did you do this?
So we got the data from a database called Afrobarometer, and this is a public opinion data questionnaires that are collected throughout 33 countries in Africa, and basically they collect social data on politics and economics and governance. But they also have 1 or 2 questions on mobile phones. So that's why we chose to use that database.
And what are the implications of this then? I mean, I know we started this conversation by looking at the reason why this matters in terms of doing health interactions and so on in resource poor settings. But given what you've now found with this data in hand and these results, how does this guide change or have implications for what we do about these health interventions over mobile devices?
Well, I think the thing about the mobile health interventions is they're being rolled out as pilot studies, so little studies to see if they work or not, if they're effective. When they're rolled out at the large scale, what will need to be done is to address the inequities, the urban rural, the gender, the age, so that the people who are the most in need of these health interventions don't suffer from not attaining access to them.
Have you looked over time, though, longitudinally at these data? Presumably this survey has been run more than once, and therefore a rate of change could be approximated. Is this a problem that will just take care of itself, it's going to fix itself, and it's going to do it quite quickly? Or are these entrenched inequalities that are not going to fix themselves and they do need active intervention?
Well, I do think a lot of them are entrenched. You're quite right. The survey has been conducted. This was the 7th wave of the survey, and mobile phone usage has been growing over time. Whether it's going to continue to grow or not depends on what's happening in Africa. Obviously, with the urbanization that's happening in every country, that suggests that greater wealth and more people would own smartphones. However, the same is happening the other way, that in rural areas people are getting poorer. So it might be that mobile phones grow, but that most people are buying the basic mobile phones rather than smartphones. But that will be addressed. More data are being collected and more data will be able to be analysed as time goes by.
Sally Blower on phone ownership across the African continent. This is the eLife podcast. I'm Chris Smith. Shortly we're going to hear about the stress that a youngster goes through when they gain a brother or a sister. But first, modern intensive agriculture usually involves the mass cultivation of a single crop species, like a field of wheat, for example. But plants didn't evolve to grow in a monoculture, and forcing them in that direction might mean that we're missing a trick in terms of yield and environmental sustainability. And that means that thinking is shifting towards using mixtures of crops. This is called intercropping, where multiple species are grown side by side and where certain characteristics in one plant could benefit the other. But the seeds we're using to plant these mixtures have often been bred and selected specifically to grow as monoculture crops, and so they might not be the pick of the bunch for the purpose that we're seeking to use them for. Laura Stephan, who's at Agroscope in Switzerland, wanted to explore this and find out whether intercrop species might evolve back to become better bedfellows again.
We were working on intercropping, so when we grow more than 2 species together, and we were thinking that usually intercropping is done with commercial seeds, but that have been bred for optimal performance in monocultures. They have been selected for decades so that they would yield better in a monoculture. And so we thought maybe these particular seeds are not the best for mixtures because the plants would have to behave differently. So we wanted to see if the crop species had this possibility to adapt.
Before we explore that, what's the reason that scientists, agronomists, farmers, producers do intercropping? Why do that at all?
So it's a way to increase the diversity of agricultural systems and to get a bit out of this intensive, very low diverse systems, which are not very good for the environment. Intercropping can be also positive in terms of finding species that are complementary to each other, and so that will a bit help each other to grow together, and this can have benefits for productivity.
Would a simple way of looking at this be then to say, well, you've got 2 different species, so they're not competing with each other directly for all the same things. There will be some competition in some respects, but one might help the other, for instance, by putting something back into the soil that boosts the other one, or one's a bit bigger, so it gives a bit of protection to the one that likes a bit of shade. Is that the kind of relationships that can be garnered from these sorts of mixtures?
Yes. One very famous example is when you mix a cereal with a legume, because the legume can fix nitrogen from the air. And so the cereal will have more access to this nitrogen.
It stands to reason, I suppose, because naturally plants evolve to grow in communities, not just a monoculture. And so what we do with agriculture really is to force them into a situation that they aren't that evolved for, and then we select for ones that can tolerate it. And you're saying, well, actually, might there be a better way where, in fact, we don't do that, and we look for plants that are better at growing in communities, and also whether there is an evolution as they do so?
Yes, that's exactly what we were trying to do. We started with an intercropping experiment, so where we had 6 species growing in monocultures, but also in mixtures of 2 and 4 species. And then we took these seeds at the end of the first year, and the second year we planted again monocultures and mixtures, but each time with seeds that were either coming from the monocultures or coming from the mixtures.
And what were you measuring? What was the outcome? Was this yield or other growth parameters?
Yeah, we measured productivity, so biomass and yield, and we also measured some classic plant characteristics along the way.
So what you'll get at there is whether or not having a monoculture and then putting that into a community is less good than having a community, getting the seeds from that, and then growing that again in a community and
Yes.
seeing if there's some kind of evolution or development or benefit that comes from that.
Yes. We looked at a plant interaction index, which basically allows you to tell whether the plants in a community are more experiencing competition or facilitation. And we did see that when the seeds were coming from the mixtures, the plants were competing less.
How are they achieving that? Is that just because basically the ones that thrive and therefore the ones that set more seed and therefore the seeds you're more likely to plant are the ones that got on well in that situation? They were already there in the population, or did that evolve and enrich with time?
The mechanisms are a bit hard to disentangle, so we thought over time the species would adapt so that they would use the resources better. We saw some indications of that. The plants coming from a mixtures were, for instance, intercepting the light better than when they had a monoculture history, which sort of indicates that they learn to use the resources better over generations.
Fascinating findings, but does it translate into significant differences in yield and plant behaviour? Because if it's just lost in the noise in terms of what sort of a difference it makes, then we could probably say, well, it's interesting, but not of commercial benefit. But is it a big difference that you get?
Practically, so far, we did not show that there was a significant increase in yield, which does not mean that there couldn't be, because our experiment was quite short. It was only 3 years. So we only had 2 generations. We know that evolutionary processes are very long term. So this might be that it didn't have enough time to happen properly. So of course, this effect should be researched further.
It's a fascinating story, isn't it? Laura Stephan there. Firstborns, parents often say, behave quite differently from their siblings lower down the birth order. Science also agrees with them, and it dubs the phenomenon the firstborn effect. But why should this be? Something about the early years, perhaps as an only child, must be influencing the subsequent development of that individual. No one knows what yet, but perhaps a sustained surge of stress hormones when a younger brother or sister comes along might be part of the answer. And that is what Andreas Bergenel from the Veterinarian University in Austria has been finding in our close relatives, bonobos.
In the moment when there is a new sibling born, the older child can show a lot of stress behavior, but what we never have tested so far was physiological stress levels. And for this, we measured cortisol levels in urine samples. Cortisol is also in humans the most important hormone that regulates stress. We wanted to know if this also happens right at the time when a new sibling is born.
Do bonobos show the same stress behaviour that humans do then? When a new one comes along and you've still got one that's relatively young, do they behave the same way as a truculent human infant does when it gets a sibling?
They show at least some more stressful behavior. They try to get closer to their mother, for example, and stay more around.
So how did you test this?
What we primarily did here was really looking for these stress hormone levels, the cortisol levels. For this, we collected urine samples when the new sibling is born, so that we can really have a look to the cortisol levels.
So it's a measure before the sibling comes along, so you know sort of what the baseline is for that infant. And then you're measuring after the sibling comes along and to see, do these stress hormones change their levels?
Exactly. And we really did that also for a long time. So not only right before or after that, but really years before and years after that for a really long time. So we could also have a look how long these increased cortisol levels stay at high levels after that.
And I presume from what you've just said that they do go up then. There is evidence of stress in the older infant when the new one is born.
Yes, indeed, really find a very extreme increase. So we found a 5-fold increase in cortisol levels, which is something, if normally you would like to stress an animal, let's say in captivity for whatever reason, then you would never get these kind of increase. So it's a really very strong increase that we could see there. And we could even see that this really high cortisol levels stayed there for about 7 months after the sibling was born. So for several months, they show very high stress levels.
And is that stress manifest in any other way? Because one of the other things cortisol does is it dampens down the immune system, doesn't it? So do the animals succumb to any other effects when this is happening to them?
What we could also see, we also measured neopterin levels, which is a kind of marker for the immune system. And there we should see a decrease. So it seems that right at the birth of a sibling, also the immune system decreases a little bit.
Was this true for both male and female infants, or was one more affected than the other?
We could see that in both, so there was no difference between males and females.
And were there any examples where this didn't happen in the infants, or was it a comprehensive effect? Every single infant got this response and it stayed up for 7 months?
From what we have seen, it was really exactly like this in each single infant, which was particularly impressive because the age at which a new sibling was born was very different between the infants. So we had some infants that were about 2 years old when a new sibling was born. We had other infants that were more than 8 years old. And all these infants, we could see exactly the same cortisol reaction.
Do you think there are any long-term consequences of them having this happen to them?
This will be a really interesting question. Periods of very high cortisol levels early in life can have very strong effects on growth rates, behavior later in life. So that's really a question if this also triggers some changes in development and also even adult behavior.
So if you have the bonobo equivalent of an only child, and they're not going to be susceptible or subject to this big cortisol surge for a prolonged period of time, 7 months, might that have long-term health consequences or behavioural consequences for those only children? Has anyone looked at that?
This will be a very important question. So one thing that we know also from humans, siblings are the strongest alliances that we can have throughout life. To some degree, they're also the strongest competitors that we have throughout life. So it can be both. Both can be benefit from each other. So at least on this level, we know that having a child can have a strong impact on the further development and life. What it means to have these kind of high cortisol levels, I think we have no idea so far, and we really have to find it out.
Might explain one or two things about many of us, mightn't it? Andreas Bergenau there. And on that note, that is it for this month. You've been listening to the eLife podcast that's produced by us here at The Naked Scientists. There are previous editions, the references, and also full text transcripts for these programmes if you want to follow up on any of the information that you've heard, as well as details on how you can subscribe to this podcast. You can find all that at nakedscientist.com/eLife. The Naked Scientists also publish a weekly science programme that covers the latest leading science stories, and you can find that at nakedscientist.com/podcast. I'll be back next month with another look inside eLife, but until then, from me, Chris Smith, we wish you a very Merry Christmas, and we look forward to your company in 2023. Goodbye.
The eLife podcast from eLife, the open access journal for outstanding research in the life and biomedical sciences. Online at elifesciences.org.